Sometimes making videos for theravenseye can be a depressing experience. This story hit me particularly hard for some reason, and I cannot even begin to imagine the pain and suffering that these parents must have gone through. So apologies if I sound a bit off whilst narrating, but it wasn't exactly a barrel of laughs doing the research for this video. The deadliest traffic accident in French history occurred in the early hours of the morning of July the 31st, 1982, when two coaches carrying children and their teachers were involved in a terrible accident on the A6 motorway just south of Beaune. The trip was a subsidised holiday organised by the prefecture of Crépy-en-Valois for low-income families who couldn't normally afford to have a summer holiday. In this case, the children were going to stay at a summer camp in the small village of Oise, located on the edge of the Vanoise National Park in the French Alps. Two chartered coaches, carrying 107 children and their 6 guardians, set off just after 8 p.m. on the night of July the 30th. It was about a 15-hour drive to Oise, so the coaches would be driving through the night, hoping to arrive at their destination by 9 o'clock the following morning. The first weekend in August was a notoriously busy time on French roads. Indeed, it was nicknamed Black Saturday. This was due to the massive traffic jams and subsequent delays as millions of French citizens took to the roads to begin their holidays. As you'd expect, there were many who wanted to beat the crowds, and as a result, traffic on the night of the 30th of July was also unusually heavy. It was around 1:45 in the morning when the accident happened. By now the coaches had been on the road for just under 6 hours, and they were on the A6 motorway just south of Beaune. It was raining heavily, and the coaches were driving towards a part of the A6 where the southbound carriageway narrowed, going from 3 lanes down to 2. At this point, all the ingredients for disaster are present. It was dark, it was raining heavily, traffic was much busier than normal, the motorways at a bottleneck, and at 1:45 in the morning there were sure to be lots of tired drivers on the road. According to eyewitnesses, 2 cars which were overtaking, still in the 3rd lane which was now merging down, were forced to cut in sharply between the 2 coaches. Right at this moment, the coach in front braked as it entered the slow-moving traffic. The 2 cars, which had just cut in, also braked sharply, but the driver of the second coach behind wasn't able to react in time, and he ran into the rear end of the second car, crushing the 2 vehicles into each other and into the rear end of the front coach. As cars slewed on the motorway to avoid the pile-up, another 2 cars crashed into the side of the rear coach, and a further 3 vehicles crashed into them. In the initial impact, the petrol tank of the rear car had split wide open, and fuel was leaking all over the road. Inside the coaches it must have been pandemonium. The sleeping children and guardians had been jolted awake as the vehicles collided. Wrenched from sleep by the sound of blaring horns and people screaming and shouting, the kids must have been startled and terrified. The children in the front coach were quickly hurried out and escorted to the side of the motorway, and they huddled there in the dark and the rain. But in the rear coach, the side door had been mangled in the crash, and it was impossible to get it open. By now, a fire had started in one of the wrecked cars and was spreading quickly to the rest of the vehicles. In desperation, one of the guardians, still left on the rear coach, broke the back window in an effort to make an escape route. Flames were leaping from car to car and to the coach filled with children. 6 vehicles were now on fire, and the flames were growing more intense with every passing second. From the shattered rear window, 15 children managed to scramble to safety, but the fire was spreading too quickly. As the rear coach was consumed in flame, nobody else made it out. Other drivers stood by and watched in horror as the coach became an inferno. One man later said, "There was just nothing anyone could do." In total, the accident claimed the lives of 53 people, 7 adults and 46 children. 44 of the children who died perished on the burning coach, having survived the initial accident. France was in shock, but nowhere more so than the small town of Crépy-en-Valois, As news of the tragedy spread, desperate and anxious family members gathered to hear the news. Had their children lived, or were they about to receive the most terrible news of their lives? The mayor read out the names of the victims in alphabetical order. The footage of mothers screaming and fainting after hearing the names of their kids being read out is just awful. No one should have to go through that. Such was the level of shock and grief surrounding the tragedy that even French President François Mitterrand attended the funeral. In the town hall, the 44 coffins of the children of Crépy-en-Valois were laid out in neat rows. Only 6 of them bore any name. The remaining 38 coffins were just numbered. The bodies had been so badly burned that identification was impossible. One mother wailed, "I don't even know which coffin to hug. I don't know where my son is." All of the victims who were not able to be identified were buried together in the cemetery, and a plaque on the wall in the church remembers the tragedy. The inquiry into the accident found that poor driving and bad weather were the primary factors for it. One witness stated that the bosses had been racing each other, flashing their lights and weaving around in traffic, but this assertion seemingly bore no fruit. Nobody else remembered seeing this. However, accident investigators did discover that the brakes on the rear coach were defective. This coach had apparently driven for over 200,000 kilometres without having its brakes looked at. The pads were pretty much worn away, and this may have contributed to the accident. The coach company was fined 25,000 francs, and the surviving driver had his licence revoked. In the wake of the tragedy, the Minister of Transport, Charles Fitteman, implemented strict new rules to try and ensure that such a loss of life on French roads would never happen again. These measures included mandatory lower speed limits for rainy conditions, speed limiters for coaches and HGVs, and the prohibition of driving school groups on buses and coaches during especially busy holiday periods. These laws remain in force to this day, and although France has certainly had its fair share of tragic road accidents since the A6 crash, the Beaune disaster remains the deadliest traffic accident in French history. A memorial garden to the victims can be found at the Aire de Courny rest stop on the A6, very close to the actual site of the accident. To this day, the residents of Crépy-en-Valois hold an annual memorial service to ensure that the victims of the A6 disaster will not be forgotten.